airplanes, I go, you're focused on the bright shiny. FedEx is not about airplanes. Airplanes just have to carry some stuff. But I mean, there's a sophisticated ground, transportation network. It's all about getting something from here reliably. And okay, Alan, you just take it on your own and go.
All right. So we got Navy in the house to keep me straight.
All right. Good morning. I'd like to welcome you to the Strategic Sealift panel. I'd like to thank the Navy League for inviting me to moderate this distinguished panel. I am Sal Mercogliano, an associate professor of history and homeland security at Campbell University in North Carolina, home of the Fighting Camels, perfect residence for a maritime historian to live. I'm also an adjunct at the U.S. Merchant Marine Academy. I teach courses in military history, maritime history, security, and industrial policy. Before my academic career, I sailed as an unlimited tonnage U.S. Coast Guard issued deck license in the Merchant Marine, specifically for Military Sealift Command, and then worked in their headquarters. I was operations officer for the Army Afloat Prepositioning Program and coordinated that effort with U.S. Transportation Command and the Maritime Administration, so I have a connection to all four members up here today. My academic research documents the role of the American Merchant Marine in national defense. I recently published a work on the Merchant Marine in the Vietnam War through the Navy History and Heritage Command. From the inception of the nation, the Merchant Marine and the Navy have had a symbiotic relationship. Many Navy leaders, John Paul Jones, Stephen Decatur, Edward Preble, learned their profession on the deck of merchant ships. As the United States emerged as a world power and ships underwent a change from wooden sail to steam and iron, the importance of the Mahanian concept of military and commercial sea power was highlighted at the dawn of the 20th century by American operations in Cuba and the Philippines. At the start of the First World War, the U.S. Navy and the Merchant Marine ranked third in the world. By the end of the First and start of the Second World War, they were both second in the world. By the end of the Second World War and the start of the Cold War, they were both first in the world. Today, the U.S. Navy remains first in the world, but the U.S. Merchant Marine is 25th. China ranks second in both those categories. It is in this situation and the requirements to fight wars overseas that the nation depends on a robust strategic lift capacity. Hence, the theme of this panel is what is being done to keep this capability modern and capacity adequate. They say amateurs talk strategy while professionals discuss logistics. So to all you professionals in the audience, welcome to this panel. It gives me great pleasure to introduce the four members who will be speaking today. First off, we'll have Rear Admiral D. Mewborn. Admiral Mewborn is a graduate of the Naval Academy. He was a naval flight officer, qualified in intruders and prowlers, and has held two commands that I'm very envious of. One of them was as the commanding officer of the USS Enterprise, and the second is as the 27th commander of the Military Sealift Command. I'm probably the only person in history that can name the previous 26 commanders. Second, Mr. Kevin Tokarski. He's Associate Administrator for the Maritime Administration. He's a graduate of the State University of New York Maritime College with a Bachelor of Science degree in Marine Transportation, the best degree and the best college, I would argue, in the world. I share that same degree and pedigree. He's been with MARAD since 1985. I've known Kevin a long time. We worked together doing the Army Prepositioning Program back in the 90s. His title is Associate Administrator for Strategic Sealift. Third, Rear Admiral John Netto is the Assistant Commandant for Prevention Policy at the U.S. Coast Guard. He has been in that position since July of 2017. He's a graduate of the Coast Guard Academy with positions all around the world, but probably the most interesting one to me is he was the Marine Safety Unit down in Wilmington and the captain of the Port of Wilmington, North Carolina. And then finally, Rear Admiral Peter Clark. He comes to us from that bastion of all that is nautical, Scott Air Force Base in Illinois. He is the J4, J5 Director of Strategy, Capabilities, Policy, and Logistics for the U.S. Transportation Command. He's a submariner thrown into the world of maritime logistics. So what we're going to do is have each of our panelists come up, do their introductions, and then we're going to get into a discussion about strategic sealift. We'll start off with Admiral Mewborn.
Thanks.
Hi, good morning. I think this hall is appropriate, for Sealift. Our ships are about, I don't know, maybe the capacity of one of our ships is maybe double this size or something like that. But when you walk inside one of our large, ro-ro ships or large speed or large capacity ships, this reminds me, this size of this cavern. Even it echoes the same. So I would begin by saying that the continuing attacks on commercial vessels operating near the Strait of Bab el-Mandeb demonstrate that there are and will remain threats to the mariners and ships that make portions of the maritime commons contested. In fact, there is broad consensus that today's security environment is faster paced, more complex, and increasingly competitive. The recently published National Defense Strategy makes this very clear when it says, quote, "We are facing increased global disorder characterized by decline in the long-standing rules-based international order, creating a security environment more complex and volatile than any we have experienced in recent memory," unquote. The strategy leaves no uncertainty as to our charge. When continuing, it says, "The nation must field sufficient, capable forces to defeat enemies and achieve sustainable outcomes that protect the American people and our vital interests." The Secretary of the Navy, the Honorable Richard Spencer, reiterated this in recent congressional testimony. Quoting a small passage here, he said, "The ability to sustain operations in international waters far from U.S. shores constitutes a distinct advantage for the United States, a Western Hemisphere nation separated from many of its strategic interests by vast oceans. Maintaining this advantage in an interconnected global community that depends on the ocean remains an imperative for the sea service and the nation." I maintain that Sealift is integral to executing the requirements of the national security and national defense strategies. To give context, let me give you just one example where Sealift was a decisive factor in the outcome of a larger national security imperative. The Battle of the Atlantic pitted German U-boats against U.S. and Allied merchant shipping. The Battle of the Atlantic, though, was not a battle, or it was not what one usually thinks of as a battle. It didn't take place in one location, or really for a short, finite period. It was a battle for control over the supply chain. Using unescorted convoys, the Allies moved equipment and supplies that using escorted convoys, the Allies moved equipment and supplies that fed, fueled, and armed Great Britain and were essential to her survival. The success of the Allied effort enabled the buildup of troops and supplies that led to the defeat of the Germans on the continent. That bears repeating. The success during this battle, a battle about logistics, enabled Allied victory in World War II. Winston Churchill, the wartime Prime Minister of the UK, noted in his memoirs the following: "The Battle of the Atlantic was the dominating factor all throughout the war. Never for one moment could we forget that everything happening elsewhere, on land, at sea, in the air, depended ultimately on its outcome." Now fast forward to today. The commander of U.S. Transportation Command, General McDough, recently said, "When the United States goes to war, U.S. Transcom moves 90% of its cargo requirements with a strategic Sealift fleet. The ability to deploy a decisive force is foundational to the national defense strategy, as the size and lethality of the force is of little consequence if we are unable to project power in the pursuit of national objectives." So what's Military Sealift's command role in the Sealift strategy, and what are we doing to support it? Our mission is clear. Military Sealift Command exists to support the joint warfighter across the full spectrum of military operations, providing on-time logistics, strategic sealift, as well as specialized mission support anywhere in the world, under any condition, 24/7, 365. Under our Surge Sealift portfolio, we operate 15 CONUS-based large roll-on, roll-off vessels and a reduced operating status located near ports of embarkation and able to load equipment within 5 days of force activation. These ships, quite literally, carry our nation to war. To give context, just one of these ships can hold half of an armored brigade combat team. A single ship can carry the equivalent of about 260 C-17s worth of cargo. There should be no doubt that maintaining this fleet poses significant challenges. When we look to industry, we note the commercial standard for ship life is about 25 years, based on the exponential rise in maintenance cost at that age. The 15 Surge Sealift ships in the MSC fleet range from 15 to 46 years old. The majority are 30 years or older. As ships and machinery get older, they require more resources to maintain them at the same level of readiness. Repair parts for many pieces of equipment are no longer available, necessitating replacement of obsolete equipment. Of the 61 ships in the MSC and MARAD Sealift fleets, 26 are steamships, a propulsion method that industry began to phase out in the 1970s. Due to the decreasing number of steamships in the fleet, there are a limited number of licensed steam engineers and number of opportunities to gain practical experience. But because mission failure is not an option, we are taking these challenges head on. Over the past 18 months, we have been instituting actions to adapt to the changing operational environment. At MSC, we like to call it bending the curve. It's our comprehensive multi-year plan of action along several lines of effort to maintain relevance despite the many challenges that I've mentioned. We are focused in 4 broad areas of improvement. First, holistic readiness, ensuring the modernization and readiness of our platforms. Second, training wholeness, ensuring our mariners have the skills to mitigate emerging threats across all dimensions. Thirdly, capability alignment, ensuring we remain aligned with the fleet and joint forces. And finally, experiential learning, ensuring that we are learning as fast as possible. Let me close by saying that MSC can't overcome the challenges alone. We've been reaching out to our partners in industry, the maritime unions, and at the maritime academies to collectively address and solve common problems. Our partners expand our scope of operations by providing additional tools to accomplish the mission. Said another way, we cannot accomplish our mission without maintaining strategic relationships with organizations that mutually strengthen one another. I acknowledge our great partners gathered in this room. We need your help in solving the complex challenges facing MSC today and in the future to ensure that our platforms, our processes, and our people remain relevant, ready, and resolute. Thank you for listening. I look forward to your questions.
Good job.
Thanks.
Well, good morning, everybody, and thank you very much for attending this session. I'm Kevin Tokarski with the Maritime Administration, and when I look out in the room, I see a lot of friends and folks that understand the maritime industry, and maybe some that this is going to be a new topic for you. So I'd ask that really our message here today is for us as part of supporting the Navy League is to convey this message to a broader audience, to a broader national discussion about why maritime matters for the nation. So I start with this first slide talking about the control of the sea, and this is really about naval power and economic power. My agency is charged with ensuring that we have a U.S. flag maritime industry that includes ships and personnel, ports, and shipbuilding capability of a significant nature to be able to support the economic viability of our nation as well as our national security. I would charge that we're not doing too good of a job at that. And if you're to measure by any level of success, we have a lot of work to do. And this administration is committed to moving this forward. The U.S. flag fleet's critical to U.S. power projection, no doubt. From our commercial industry base, that gives us the strength, the global logistics, the global intermodal capability from our international trading fleet of the Maritime Security Program. But the fleet today is at the lowest level in American history, with just over 80 ships remaining in international trades. We move less than 2% of our imports and exports on U.S. flag ships. Some people see this as purely an economic issue. The flag fleet's not competitive. But history reminds us that this has national security ramifications. And as the fleet declines, so does the base of the merchant mariners, the shipbuilding and repair industry, all essential components to national security. As Administrator Busby mentioned in yesterday's opening panel, we're on the ragged edge with perhaps just enough. But I think what we really want the point we have to stress is that we don't have enough and we need more capability than we have today. Too few carriers. So on the world's commercial maritime picture, how much influence do we think we really have? Look at the numbers there. About 80 ships carry the American flag. And I wonder, from a national strategy perspective, how different that would be for the United States Navy and the United States Coast Guard if we had a larger flag fleet. Would it be greater for commerce and greater for the freedom of navigation? U.S. maritime presence has never been less. Our sea power provides us the freedom to access the global commons with unimpeded freedom of the seas. This soft power is foundational to global leadership. Commercial U.S. flagships provide a visible extension of power and presence of the U.S. military, which aids in promoting stability, providing deterrence, strengthening alliances and partnerships, and demonstrating U.S. resolve to potential adversaries. Foreign countries are eclipsing us. And these are some of the questions that we struggle with as an agency and I think as a nation to help create greater awareness. Do we need to revitalize our maritime capabilities? Is it transportation? Is it economics? Is it national security? Or maybe it's really all three. Do we want or do we need to have a global presence? And does flag matter? And then I asked rhetorically, who still reads Mahan? Well, there's a battle raging out there as we speak, and it's over maritime sea power. And it strikes at the very core of national security. The fact that we merely have a toehold in our international commerce points to the fact that our economy has a kill switch, and it's at the hands of others who've wrapped around the throttle. So someone's thinking about sea power. It's not us. Chinese have grown their maritime fleet by over 400% in the past decade through their massive scrap and build subsidy and direct state-owned investment and ownership. They've grown to become the world's largest shipbuilder, and in spite of the collapse of the global freight market, they continue to invest heavily in qualitative improvements in their shipbuilding capability, requiring shipyards to incorporate military specifications into the design of every commercial vessel. More importantly, they've undertaken the largest infrastructure initiative in human history with the Chinese-led One Belt, One Road initiative, a $1.7 trillion in financing investment. You look at the scale of some of these investments, $400 billion for the Maritime Silk Road, $50 billion for the Asian Infrastructure Bank. Now put it into context and the price tag for our maritime support programs for international fleet, $300 million. And just to get to a quick idea of One Belt, One Road's scale, the infrastructure footprint unfolding is already in 68 nations. They already own or have major investments in 60% of the world's major ports. They're building a China-centric infrastructure with massive networks to control ports, terminals, and intermodal facilities. And if the plans are realized, they'll control on that network 3/4 of the world's GDP. That's unquestionable political and economic leverage. Now, this isn't a critique. It's quite actually, it's envy, because they understand the importance of commercial maritime dominance. And I fear commercial dominance over military dominance because commercial dominance can be used against us in peacetime. Some consequences to the nation. Losing our maritime capabilities, we become more dependent, vice independent in our global logistics capability. It certainly affects our power projection capabilities and sustainment. So here's why America needs us to work together. We need a national maritime strategic vision to take a fresh look at what a maritime strategic vision could be as an aspirational goal, to have an innovative, competitive U.S. maritime system that enhances multimodal mobility and ensures our national economic security in an increasingly globalized world. Desired end results of a national maritime transportation strategy could be a true commitment to an economically viable international fleet, to assure U.S. competitiveness and national security, to meet the U.S.'s future needs with the right mix of ships for both economics and national security, a commitment to recruiting, educating, training, and retaining the best mariners and workers to provide a long-term career path at all levels of the industry, important infrastructure expansion and modernization, and to prioritize the investment strategy, and a steady demand for shipbuilding and repair with modern shipyards using innovative ships and using the latest technologies. So not to end this panel with what sounds like dire news or a lost battle, there are a few positive developments with regards to commercial sealift and recapitalizing the government sealift force. First is that the administration has taken a keen interest in improving maritime competitiveness for ships and ports, the infrastructure, and mariners. These engagements, while ongoing to determine the best pathway forward, are involving the White House's Trade and Manufacturing Office, the National Security Council, Council of Economic Advisors, and the host of the interagency. From my personal perspective, the good news is that we're not arguing about whether we need to have a merchant marine and the mariners to support it, but more on how to rebuild it in the best manner. And one of the primary drivers that have given these discussions such visibility has been because of our raised concerns about the size of the mariner pool. And as documented in a recent report to Congress, and this stoplight chart shows that we're just on the verge of red of not having enough mariners to be able to activate the 63 ships between Military Sealift Command and the Maritime Administration. Our report to Congress highlighted a shortfall of just under 2,000 mariners. And that report notes that we need every mariner to volunteer, every one. So the numbers are worse than they appear. The awareness has also been championed by leadership within the Department of Defense, including TRANSCOM, the Joint Chiefs, and OSD. The mariners come from the commercial industry, and we need to leverage them in peacetime so that we have them available in wartime. So we need more ships to move a substantial portion of our cargo. Today, I said we were doing about 1.5%. China has a stated policy of moving 25% of their imports and exports on Chinese flag and Chinese-built ships. Heck, I'd be happy with 5%. You know, 5%, if we move 5% of our cargo, imports and exports, that would translate to a size flag fleet today of 500 ships. We'd be done with strategic sealift. We'd have enough mariners, we'd have enough ships to be able to do that. And yet, if you told the average American we're only going to settle for 5%, they're going to tell you it needs to be bigger. I believe that if we could have a rational goal of just even that level, that would make a significant impact. Talk about quickly our roll-on, roll-off square foot shortfall or the capacity as our fleet ages out. From the thousands of ships that we had at the end of World War II to the 46 that we have today, our average age is around 44 years of that fleet. We have a unified strategy with Navy and with TRANSCOM that looks at recapitalizing the Maritime Administration's Ready Reserve Force fleet, principally through two mechanisms. The first is to take selective ships and extend them to 60 years. So we were planning on 50. We're going to extend these ships out to 60 years, or what I call no man's land for keeping assets in salt water. Through selective upgrades of machinery, systems, and that, we believe we'll be able to move about half of the fleet out to that timeline. The other half we need to recapitalize, and that we are primarily targeting on U.S. flagships that exist today, including in our domestic and maritime security program fleet. So as a ways to be able to recapitalize our commercial sealift fleet at the same time as recapitalizing our government fleet. Last, on the national security multi-mission vessel front, the administrator mentioned that the Congress recently, in the omnibus bill, allocated $300 million for the new construction, the first time purpose-built ship for training, as well as a national security multi-mission capability to be able to support homeland response. It's a standard design. It improves the quality and training with modern ships. It's designed to meet for the first time the international SOLAS requirements for special purpose ships, as our current training ships do not. Compliant with all environmental standards and its design is to enhance response capabilities and accommodates modular configuration for mission-specific functions. And our next steps in how we're going to proceed, we'll have an industry day in late May, probably in the DC-Baltimore area. And then following our congressional guidance and funding, Merit intends to contract with a construction manager to begin the selection of a shipyard. And there may be more money coming. The President's budget has $300 million in request for $300 million in 2019, which could be the second ship. And we're hopeful that it will continue because we're short training ship capacity today with the immediate need for three vessels. In conclusion, I'd like to thank the Navy League for their stalwart support of the U.S. flag merchant marine and our industrial base for ports and for shipyards. And I'd like to thank the panel members who, together with our agency, continue to support our goals, unified as one team. Thank you. Hey, thanks, John.
Well, good morning, everybody. It is a great pleasure to be here and a privilege and an honor to share the stage with such distinguished colleagues of mine. And I suspect some of you out there are saying, why is there a Coast Guard admiral up here with these gentlemen? What does the Coast Guard have to do with Sealift capacity of the United States? That's a fair question. Hopefully, in a short few minutes, I'll help you understand. So I'm going to step back a little bit, talk big picture. We're focused in on the ships. I just want to take it back a little bit. You know, America, as a nation, we are a maritime nation. We have natural waterways, deep ports, protected harbors, unfettered access to two of the world's largest oceans. And the nation's robust marine transportation system consists of 25,000 miles of inland waterways that go out throughout the heartland, 95,000 miles of shoreline, 360 ports, and all that is marked with 50,000 aids to navigation. And through that whole network, we have thousands of ships moving at any given moment. And that whole network, that system, sustains 23 million American jobs and $4.6 trillion of economic activity every year. That's a gift for the nation. So since our beginning, the Coast Guard, 228 years ago, we've been entrusted with some broad authorities, and we've had an enduring responsibility to safeguard this gift that the nation has and ensure the uninterrupted free movement of goods and people. And today we're charged with ensuring the safety, security, and sustainability of this marine transportation system. As Admiral Mewbourne pointed out, General McDew is very clear, and I've heard him a few times. I love it. And as recent as last month, I was looking at his testimony before the House Armed Services Committee. He said the U.S. is the world's only superpower because of our global influence and our ability to project power around the globe at a moment's notice. And that doesn't happen without the Sealift fleet. That makes it a priority for the Coast Guard. We have 11 missions, and I think that 5 of them have some impact on what we're trying to accomplish as a nation. We have to get underway. First, we have a ports, waterways, and coastal security to keep the ports secure while we're trying to load up the ships, move them, discharge them. We have aids to navigation, which I touched on, to make sure everything's properly marked so we can move safely and efficiently through the waterways. We have marine environmental protection. The Coast Guard plays a role in actually the loading and the discharge of the ships, particularly with respect to explosives and hazardous cargoes, to make sure they're loaded safely, prevent incident. And lastly, one that doesn't happen often would be ice operations. Should we have an incident we're trying to load and there is ice on the waterway, we have the capability to break the ice and keep the ships moving. And the one that's probably most pertinent is marine safety. Where we do the ship inspections, we're talking about commercial ships, commercial standards, licensed mariners. The Coast Guard has a big role there. We're on board these ships, inspecting them to the federal and international standards as they apply, and making sure that they are safe and secure. So the cargo we move is going to be loaded in ports where there's a local Coast Guard captain of the port responsible for that area. And the cargo is going to be loaded on U.S. flag ships that are inspected by the Coast Guard. And then those ships are going to be operated by mariners that are licensed and credentialed by the Coast Guard. It's important to us. We enjoy a great partnership with our friends. Friends up here, Dee and I have spent a lot of time together, as well as Kevin and Admiral Busby. As you just heard about the fleet and some of the challenges we face, the Coast Guard is there with them on board these ships. We do have a memorandum of understanding, memorandum of agreement, and we have been involved for decades to make sure that we can be there to help assure that the standards are being complied with, and again, the ships remain safe and secure for the mariners that have to operate them. Though some of the ships may be exempt from some of the standards, both MSC and MARAD have made it a matter of policy to comply with all standards where they can meet them. Again, that's where the Coast Guard comes in. So we strongly support all efforts to make sure that this nation has a Sealift fleet that it needs to meet the mission. A couple recent developments that I'll mention for awareness. First, the Coast Guard Authorization Act a couple years back required us to take a look at the federal regulations. There was a perception that U.S. regulations were creating a cost disadvantage for U.S. flag ships, that they could not compete internationally. We had the National Academy take a look at that, and they concluded that it wasn't the regulations, they really didn't have a lot of impact on the cost of operating a U.S. flag ship. However, they did point out some things that were very useful to us. They pointed out that some of the processes we use to reflag ships that are built for and want to operate U.S., that process for reflagging them could be improved. So we met with NDTA and now our partners on the NDTA Sealift Committee. And in fact, we have a working group beneath that committee. We meet regularly with the operating companies that operate these ships to make sure that we are not making anything any harder than it needs to be, and that we have great communications with our partners. Secondly, I don't think anyone's mentioned it today, would be cyber. Certainly, General McDougall is very clear when he talks about the cyber threat and what that means to the whole logistics system. Using our authorities, we have moved out and working with NIST and the NIST Cybersecurity Center of Excellence to develop some standards, some guidelines for all of the facilities that would be used, all facilities that dot the waterways and are located in our ports, to help ensure that they are upping their game with respect to cyber. And then the ships themselves, we have gone to the International Maritime Organization to make sure that cyber risk management for a vessel is incorporated as part of the vessel safety management system. Trying to keep pushing in that area because it's certainly one we all need to pay attention to. So, in closing, the Coast Guard remains and is an active partner and stakeholder in these discussions we're having this morning. Through our broad authorities and our missions, we support MSC, MARAD, and TRANSCOM multiple ways. And we're keenly aware of this vital need for a safe, secure, and sustainable marine transportation system. It's critical to the nation's economy, and even more important, it's crucial for national security. Thank you. I look forward to your questions. Go get it.
Good morning. I have the advantage of being last. The advantage is that, as you can hear, every one of my partners on this stage understands the importance of Sealift in accomplishing U.S. Transportation Command's mission. Already talked about the fact that the United States is a global superpower is as a result of our ability to deliver decisive combat power at the time of our choosing anywhere in the world. Nobody else can do that. There are a couple of other great powers, and if you read our national defense, we are in a time period of great power competition, but they are great powers, not superpowers. In order for us to maintain that distinction, we must maintain the ability to deliver that decisive combat power at a time of our choosing. One of the challenges coming up in the near future is how do we do that with a dwindling U.S. Search, Ready Reserve, and commercial fleet. And we're going to have to do that. We're going to have to be able to deliver that decisive combat power, not the way we've done it in the past, not from the garrisons in the continental United States. But if you read the National Defense Strategy, we have to be able to have resilient and agile logistics. That means on the concept of dynamic force employment, we have to be able to move the force, deliver the force from anywhere in the world to where it is needed in order to provide deterrence or combat power should conflict arise. We may have to move brigade combat teams out of Europe or out of the Middle East to the Pacific, or from the Pacific to Europe. We just don't know, and we have to have the means to be able to do that. General McDough speaks of setting, balancing, and using the globe. That's what it means. It means being able to respond to crisis anywhere in the world with forces that are deployed already anywhere in the world. So to do that, as already mentioned, we move most of our forces, our decisive forces, via Sealift. 90% of that decisive force is going to move by sea. An immediate force will be moved by airlift, and it will get there overnight so we can engage on our terms. But in order to get the decisive force and then to sustain that decisive force over a long conflict, we will rely completely, almost completely, on the Sealift. We are not in a good position for the future today. You've already seen a slide put up by Mr. Tokarski that shows if we don't start doing something that our capacity, which is exactly where we need it today in order to meet the needs of our significant operational plans in time of war, our capacity will start dropping precipitously. We have to start recapitalizing that Sealift fleet now. Congress has given us authority to buy 2 used vessels. That process will start next year. That is important, but 2 vessels won't do it. So we must continue our efforts to get authority to buy used vessels as a stopgap measure until we can build new ships, which is part of the ships. The Navy's 30-year strategy for shipbuilding includes buying or building new Sealift type of vessels. The third part of a triad that gives us the necessary Sealift is commercial Sealift. At the end of World War II in 1950s, we had over 1,000 U.S. flagged vessels. At the beginning of Desert Shield, we had about 200, and as you saw already, we have 82 today. Those commercial roll-on, roll-off ships primarily, but cargo ships also, that are engaged every day in international trade are also vital to moving the military at the time of need. If we don't have the capacity in our U.S. Sealift to do so, we will have to rely on international commercial shipping, which is a position which we don't necessarily want to be in. So that Sealift recapitalization, organic and maintaining the viability of the commercial fleet, is critical to meeting our needs in the future. The other item we are very concerned about is being able to operate in a contested environment. The U.S. has not had to deploy forces in a contested environment in many, many years, really since World War II. That's going to change the next time we're in conflict. Our adversaries have seen what we can do if we can build combat power unobstructed. We fully expect that the adversary will start taking action to deny us the ability to build out combat power long before we start any type of shooting war. That contested environment starts in the cyber domain, and it really starts today. It's ongoing now. So, as also mentioned already, it is important that we improve our cyber domain capabilities in order to provide that protection so at time of war, or any time of need, we can reliably command and control those forces and get our military where it needs to be. The last thing I wanted to mention before we get on to questions is I also wanted to foot stomp on the impact that China's strategy can have on us if we're not really aware, conscious of what is going on, and make smart decisions to mitigate it. You heard that China has interest in 60% of world's ports, something to that effect. Let me put a finer point to it. That's 462 critical ports around the world as of the end of 2017, in which they operate, have control, or own the facilities. They operate and are invested heavily in the Panama Canal, and they have most recently taken over ownership of ports in Djibouti, two critical places in the world, two choke points where access for us is critical for us to be able to deliver those forces. So it's not specifically related to Sealift recapitalization, but it is truly important to the TRANSCOM mission. I'll leave that for you, and I'll turn it over to our moderator to start us with questions. Thank you.
Thank you, gentlemen, for your statements. I'd like to give everybody an opportunity if there's anything they want to respond to or any comments based on our panelists before we get going.
I don't think so. No.
All right, let me ask this question. Cooperative strategy for sea power, and to a lesser extent, the national defense strategy, overwhelmingly focuses on the military application of sea power. As Mr. Tokarski mentioned, who reads Mahan anymore? Hopefully my students do. I sign it all the time. But Mahan talks about that commercial versus the military application of sea power. So I'll be interested in how you, your organizations, and commands kind of bridge that divide between the military and the commercial application of sea power and get that information out, because this seems in many ways, we're very comfortable with Sealift. Sealift seems to do the mission for us all the time. It's only when that Sealift isn't there that you realize it, and at that point, it's too late. So I was wondering if Admiral Newport, if you wouldn't mind starting, what are you and your command are doing to kind of bridge that information gap out there?
I think MSC is an extension of the Navy. We exist wholly to support the naval and joint warfighter. We understand that our mission is all about assuring the logistics that are needed across the full spectrum of operations, and we are very proud of the heritage that we've come from from World War II to this day over the decades. I would say that for us, that we have probably in some ways lost touch a little bit of our roots over sailing in uncontested waters and taking advantage of sort of the peace dividends that existed, especially post-Soviet Union. And we took advantage of that uncontested environment and the efficiencies that we gained in business applications and business study in order to become more and more efficient and be very effective. MSC today is the best in the world, I would say, at what we do. We can take this bottle of water, we can deliver it anywhere in the world and ensure that it gets there. But can we do that against a great power competition in which the seas are a battlefield? And I maintain the one thing I would just add to maybe Admiral Clark's comment is that I maintain that the seas are contested today. They're not at the full degree of contested, but to the sailors that go through, or the mariners that go through the Strait of Bab el-Mandeb right this moment, there are forces that are there that have a capability to hold their ships at risk. And there are other places in the world, especially in the vicinity of choke points and coastal areas, where there are systems, that can do the same. So the tie between, supporting the joint warfighter the military application of sea power and the maritime, and MSC and the mariners, the civilian mariners that we employ, I think that there is a fantastic history of integration that we have enjoyed and is only maturing as we operationalize MSC to ensure that it's relevant in a new and a changing operational environment.
Mm-hmm. Sal, I'll add on, and Admiral, I think you're right about the contested environment. I think of just in the last few days, I keep reading about purposeful interference of GPS affecting shipping. So that threat is out there as well. I think, Sal, it's very important for us in terms of, it's akin to the Navy League message about awareness. And so the understanding, frankly, people have forgotten why we have a merchant marine and how we leverage that capability, and bridging it as a national instrument of our national security policy is key. There's many folks that don't understand that. They don't understand why we have policies that require government cargo to move on board U.S. flag ships. And frankly, I mean, I've been up against the foes that have said, I don't want to pay for that readiness. Other government agencies that don't want to pay for that readiness, they don't see the value back that, no, having our merchant fleet provides security for the nation, for everybody, even the farmers and the people that want to disseminate food aid. We're all in this together. And so part of what our agency works very hard on is that advocacy messaging and leveraging that commercial fleet. So I don't look at a ship out there today, even if it's a bulk vessel moving bulk grain, there's military readiness in that vessel because of the mariners that they employ as being a key instrument that we're going to need to be able to leverage that. So that, I think, as we message that, and we've had a long history together. The first ships of the Navy came from where? The Merchant Marine, right? And so that linkage is critical, and it's instrumental to our foundation and going forward as well.
Yeah. I think I would just hit on a couple things. We get to go aboard all those foreign ships, right? We said there's 50,000 foreign ships sailing around the globe. About 9,000 of them come to the United States every year and get boarded by the Coast Guard. These are the foreign flag commercial vessels. And it strikes me that we get on those vessels and we also get on board our U.S. flag, which again is a much smaller number. I don't think you could, it's impossible to overestimate the challenge that's before us when you take a ship that is, 3 times older than the average age of the world's fleet. And it sits tied to the dock most of its time with a skeleton crew, half the normal crew, 8, 10, 11 people. A big ship. These are the big ones. That sits. We absolutely need that readiness level. There's no doubt. But I think Admiral Eborn, the word used, maybe complacent. I do believe that we got a little complacent as a nation. And to get back that level of readiness that we all know we need and want is going to take a significant effort and sustained effort. Again, I don't think you can overestimate what an investment looks like today. 2 ships is a good start, but boy, we got a long way to go. We're on those ships regularly, and the commitment is there. There's no doubt. I just hope that we as a nation can find it. Commit and have the resolve to stay committed, because it's going to be a little while. It's a journey. It's a journey we're just starting to get to the level we need to be at. Thanks.
Thanks. I agree with everything that's been said. I'd like to emphasize that, to the point of maybe a divide between military application of sea power and commercial application, I don't see a divide at all. I see those as complementary to achieving the same mission, and that the Navy applies combat power by sailing to the fight. Well, the Army applies power by having Sealift take them to the fight. It is part of our joint fighting concept, and whether it's the organic Sealift, which will be there in the port of embarkation within 5 days to take the first salvo of forces across the ocean, or the commercial Sealift that will come in behind at the 30, 40-day point because they could be sailing anywhere in the world and they have to drop off the cargo they're carrying and then get back to the port of embarkation. All of those forces act together in order for us to deliver the needed combat capabilities anywhere in the world. So the readiness of all of them is critical in order for us to meet our strategic needs.
You mentioned contested environment. I'd like to talk a little bit more about that. Obviously, when we think contested environment, the obvious is the enemy submarine type preventing you from going, but there's many more levels of contested environment today. Just a couple come to mind. Maersk Lines, which is a large international operator. We have a Maersk Lines Limited that's one of the largest operators for us, suffered a cyber attack that nearly crippled their industry. It had amazing ramifications for disrupting their network. We saw the collapse of a major shipping line with Hanjin Marine a few years ago that utterly stopped 94 ships on the surface of the ocean. And I'm interested in your viewpoint on this contested environment. How are we prepared to deal with that? Our over-reliance, maybe in some cases, on the consolidation of these large shipping firms that handle our cargo. A lot of cargo goes off, into a system today that may transfer off ships, and by the time it shows up at a port in Karachi or Riga or even Vladivostok, heading to Afghanistan, it may change hands several times. So I was wondering your perception on the contested environment that our strategic Sealift faces today. Admiral Clark, if you want to start this up.
Absolutely. Great question. At U.S. Transportation Command, we are laser focused on raising the visibility of the contested environment that we operate in every day, as Admiral Milborn mentioned. Whether it's in cyber, whether it's in information operations, whether it's GPS denial, or our adversaries with a very long view strategically remapping the world to ensure that their influence prevails at time of need. That is all contested environment. There are certain things that we have prioritized, and number one is cyber, as we've already talked about. We have worked with commercial industry to ensure they upgrade their standards to the NIST standards that were mentioned previously, both in Sealift and in Airlift. We are moving all of our Transcom operations, all of our systems to the cloud because we believe that will provide us better data security. It truly is about data integrity and data security that provides us the mission assurance to be comfortable that as our forces and goods and products get moved across the world, and that's intermodal means that you described, and they change hands from one contractor to another or from one force to another, that we have good visibility on it, that we know that where the equipment is, where the forces are, and when they're going to get to where they're needed. Going to the cloud is step one. Also, we are embarking in developing a transportation management system that will provide us better control and better visibility. So there are many different areas in which we are going after this contested environment. We've also started working very heavily with our other geographic combatant commanders to ensure that they address the contested environment in their operational planning. As General McDougall likes to say, the pixie dust factory at the bottom of the Transcom building is closed. You can no longer do a war game or start operational planning with the assumption that all the stuff got there. You can't just, put the pixie dust on the paper and say, okay, we're going to start at day 0 of the war. All of the forces got there. No attrition. That's just not realistic, and we have to stop planning that way. We have to start planning that there is going to be attrition, whether it's attrition as a result of kinetic action or whether it's attrition because the adversary got into the command and control of the railways that prevented the brigade combat team from loading from their garrison and didn't even make it to the port of embarkation. Or they get to the port of embarkation and they get on the ship, and then there's a GPS denial and the ship can't sail, whatever the case may be. All of those things are being addressed. We run our own Transcom contested environment war games in which we bring our civilian partners in to ensure that they're thinking at the same level that we are thinking. It's truly what's driving our vision for the future.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Anybody else? Go ahead.
You know, I'd say you're absolutely right. The contested environment in the 1940s is different than our idea of the contested environment today. Fundamental assumptions in the 1940s, you're pretty safe. If you had the physical boundaries, you could operate safely. Today, there are no physical boundaries with the domain. The domain, the cyber domain. The cyber domain has no physical boundaries. So the 16-year-old sitting in North Korea can hack in right now and potentially take over who knows what. I'm not a military planner, I'm not a strategist, but I do see the real impacts in the commercial environment where a tech rep walks aboard a ship today and goes on board with his little stick, plugs it into a system to start doing some update to some piece of equipment, which is networked to other things aboard that vessel, which may then be tied to the shore side to who knows what. Who checks that person's credentials? Who checks that person to make sure they're doing what they're supposed to be doing? Who checks the equipment they bring on board? There are some, I guess we need to increase the cyber hygiene. We're just beginning now. There's shared awareness, and we're starting, as I said, to get some NIST standards out there. But there's a lot of work yet remains to be done. And I think that those fundamental assumptions that used to hold valid, today we have to really question, are those still true? We're going to be challenged right here at home, potentially.
So I'd just add with that comment, it was a great one, because having an old fleet of ships that are basically analog, so I thought, well, you don't have so much of a cyber risk anymore. So then I go on to ships and I thought, well, our boiler automation systems, I'd asked the chief engineer, do you have a USB port somewhere on? He goes, yeah, we do. I go, really? Go chew some gum and stick it in there so it can't be done and used. But so it's permeated even in our ships that are 50 years old, and now we've got obviously cyber vulnerabilities and risks associated with that. I think one of the things, and hats off, I think, to Coast Guard and Transcom, particularly in Transcom, you reached out to industry. You didn't just say, hey, there's a problem, you need to have cybersecurity. You helped industry figure out how to do it. And I think the continuation, as this evolves, it's going to be that continued sharing of information. You know, fortunately, our ocean carriers and that, they can sit down and have classified discussions with them. And you do have cyber games at the class level. So they're able to participate and fully understand it and take that back. So it is really one whole team approach to that. And I think in the future, we're going to see some more. If we've got ships that in the MSP that we identify as our frontline sustainment ships, we need to be thinking about what are we giving them in terms of secure PNT. So they don't have a secure GPS unit, secure communications. I think we're going to have to start looking at that and planning for it, looking at the budgeters. We're going to need to be planning as part of that whole Sealift capability that we've got to make sure that whole fleet is ready, not just our own government ships, but also the commercial industry ships that we're going to be leveraging.
You know, I mentioned it just in my prepared remarks, right, that we're broadly looking in 4 areas, working in 4 areas, excuse me, to what I call bend the curve, and that is to match, to ensure that we maintain our relevance that we have today in a contested future. And we need to be able to sail on the seas like we do today, even if they're a battlefield, in order to assure that we get the mission done. Our nation depends on that. So these 4 areas, as I mentioned, one was, you know, the holistic readiness of the ships, and a lot has been said about that, making sure that, that we're doing everything that we can to assure that when we go to turn the key, they get underway and take the nation to war. The other area that I just kind of glossed over, right, was this idea of training wholeness. How do you ensure that the mariners who are on these ships that come out of our union halls across the country and man these raw ships, 5 days later, you know, they get underway, they go to a port of embarkation, and they pick up the Army or the Navy or the Marine Corps, whatever, and they start heading off. How do we teach them the skills that they need? They don't necessarily know what a zigzag maneuver is, or they don't know what MCON is, or we've probably, I would maintain that we have lost a lot of the the baseline knowledge that was probably imbued into the Mariner base after World War II, because we've had these decades of sailing an uncontested environment. So part of what we're doing, working with the maritime academies and with the unions, is to talk to them about how do we ensure the training of these mariners to do the basic, those basic tactics that would avoid detection, that would avoid, and if they are detected, targeting, and if they are targeted, that would ensure or help ensure their survival if attacked. And the attack doesn't have to be physical, as was mentioned. It can be a cyber attack. The other thing that we're working on is in an area that I call experiential learning, learning faster. And we're doing a lot of experimentation with an MSC. We have a group that leads this effort. We call it the Toluga Group, named after our first oiler that we received in the command. And it was in the vanguard, much like this group is taking us in areas that we have not yet gone, to explore ways that we can either counter or that we can mitigate some of the contested concerns that we have. And so those are just, I would say that everything that the panel has talked about are all areas that we have people working on, committed to solving those issues. A lot of them are hard. My purpose or my message to this audience is that we can't do it alone at MSC, nor can I think any of us. I need John and his partnership, right? We need Transcom, and we need MARAD, and I need all the partners here that can help us bend this curve to ensure that we are prepared to do what we have to do. Hopefully we never will end up in some sort of future conflict with a great power, but I know that everyone here will want us to be ready in case that day comes.
Okay. I'm going to ask one more question. We're going to have some microphones out in the audience there for questions from the group here after we answer this question. So if you have a question you want to address to the panel, there's microphones set up in the back, and we'll have somebody walking around with a microphone. After conflicts in the past, just most recently go to Vietnam and Operation Desert Storm, we learned lessons out of that, and we've altered the way we've done strategic Sealift. So out of Vietnam, you see the creation of the Ready Reserve Force, a higher level of readiness out of the National Defense Reserve Fleet, the creation of the pre-positioning fleet after Vietnam. After Operation Desert Storm, the creation of the large medium-speed RoRos, the plus-up in the RRF for that. And today our strategic Sealift, we've talked a lot about recapitalization of the RRF fleet, but our strategic Sealift is much more encompassing. It's the pre-positioning squadrons out in Diego Garcia and the Marianas. It is the surge Sealift, LMSRs, the XMPS ships, and the RRF. And then it's also the sustainment that comes in from programs kicked out after ODS2, the Maritime Security Program and the VISA, the Voluntary Intermodal Shipping Agreement. I was wondering if we get an assessment on the status of those programs and where they stand today. So, Admiral, if you want to start with the pre-positioning, and then we'll go down the line here a little bit.
Well, I'd say the pre-positioning program is very much alive and well, as you described. We have ships, 2 squadrons right now that are in the vicinity of the Marianas, and the other one is home based out of Diego Garcia.
They underwent a big transformation fairly recently, and I was wondering.
Well, the transformation, the recent there's nothing, not in my tenure. Right. The big transformation I think you're talking about is this disestablishment of MIPSRON 1, and now we just have 2 and 3 that are located there in the Pacific. But we keep those ships in a very high state of readiness. The equipment with our partners in the Air Force, Army, and the Marine Corps, the sponsors are wonderful to work with and make sure that we are circulating and keeping everything in a very, very high state of readiness. So I think that's probably all I need to say. I've got 24 ships that are really involved. 15 of them are, kind of cargo-carrying RoRo ships, and the other one, these 9 special ships, part of the PREPO program. And, I'm very proud of the efforts that our industry partners, our sponsors, and the other services, the leadership on the deck plates, whether you're the mariners, be them mariners or be them, the MIPSRON staffs themselves. Everyone really understands that is the very, very tip of the spear when it comes to, Sealift, are those ships. And I think that probably answers your question.
Admiral Clark, if you wouldn't mind, on the MSP and the visa program.
Certainly. And I'll add a third component to that, because they all go to maintaining a viable U.S. industrial base, a viable U.S. flagged Sealift, and viable U.S. merchant marine cadre. So the third thing is the Jones Act. Controversial these days, but all three of those components, Jones Act, Voluntary Intermodal Sealift Agreement, Military or Maritime Support Program, MSP, all of them go towards ensuring that the U.S. can deliver combat forces at the time of our choosing via the maritime domain with our own capabilities, not having to rely on foreign flagged ships manned by foreign crews. There are times where we will go to war with our allies and our partners, and they will have significant capability that they can bring to bear, but there may be times that we have to do it alone, and we have to be capable of doing it alone. That is the absolute bedrock requirement, and anything that detracts from the ability of maintaining those ships being U.S. flagged, which generate the required number of U.S. merchant mariners, is detrimental to our mission.
And if I can add something to the question for Mr. Tokarski and Admiral Nato, the 6 state maritime academies, the federal academy, are producing more graduates now than in record number. We're actually having a huge boon. At the same time, regulatory issues are becoming extremely, intricate. You have a new law going into effect on January 1, 2020, with sulfur emissions going from 3.5 down to 0.5%. We have a shortage of mariners, but it's more place than that. I think it's senior mariners. It's the upper levels. And what can we do to make sure that those measures are enforced, and what do those measures mean for us as we go forward?
I think from a standpoint of, you're right, we are producing a record number of merchant mariners today, right? The schools are booming because there's been a great demand for their technical skill sets that the graduates have, and they come out and the career statistics in that show, they actually do very well. It's a great investment for the nation in that, because these people go off and end up having a very high earning careers. But the retention of the senior officers that we need, it goes down fundamentally to having the ships to be able to support that. So we've got a tale of two worlds. We have a pretty healthy Jones Act fleet. There's more ships in the Jones Act fleet today, large ocean-going ships in that fleet, than we have in the international fleet. And we're seeing that slow growth continues in those trade areas. And it's Admiral Clark's right. It's bedrock instrumental to our flag fleet, is having strengthening the Jones Act fleet for it as well. I would offer just one thing on the last question.
Please.
About a change. One of the dynamics that's changed significantly is the base of cargo. Government-impelled cargo has shrunk significantly. And we're not suggesting that we're going to start exporting more cargo for DoD or for the other civilian agencies. But when that dynamic changed, that's going to change how the MSP program has functioned effectively, because that was one of the key legs of the MSP program. And so I think we're working with Transcom and looking at industry about what does the next generation of the MSP program need to be, so that we've got the right ships in the program, we've got the right international global logistics capability for that as well. So when you talk about some of the changes that's going to happen, I think we're on the cusp of seeing some significant change in the next few years. And the other thing Admiral Newborn and I have talked at length about is we don't have enough tankers. Right. And that to me is a big shortfall, is that we don't have enough tankers with assured access to be able to support our nation's needs.
There's very interesting things being done by the British with their Point class ships, and the Germans and Danes in the R class having almost like an active RRF, and those are programs that are out there.
Yeah, and they have 5 ships.
Right.
I sit on the NATO as chair of the NATO Transport Group Ocean Shipping, and we talk about our allies, and I ask our allies, I say, what ships do you have under your flag control, and do you have the mechanisms for an assured access program to be able to recall that Sealift capability? And I get crickets, right, except for a few ships that they have. And so we're trying to create some greater awareness that our allies need to invest in having assured access to their controlled ships as well. And I remind them, the flag on the back of their ships matters just as much as it does to me.
Admiral?
I'd say you're right. We're graduating lots of people from the academies. That's great, but need jobs. And need jobs on big ships. You know, you can't go on a tug. That's a great job, but that's not going to get you qualified to go on the ships we need you to go on. You won't get the time, the sea time, and the experience to meet the competency requirements to satisfy to get your license for a deep draft, large ro-ro. Different. So we need to have that capacity under sailing the U.S. flag, whether it is MSP, which we have tried to scope down, again, working with the operators and the operating companies to really skinny down the process the hoops have to jump through to become a U.S. flag. We work closely with them and try and make that as painless as possible. But whether it's through Crook or we build our own or we get some foreign that we reflag, we need more deep draft ships for these people to work on.
And you see the construction in OSV fleets, ITBs, ATBs. There's a lot of, under 1,600 ton construction going on. But you're right, for the deep draft, that doesn't do. The pollution aspect, if you don't mind, what that impact means in the plight of steamships, which the U.S. government becomes the largest owner of, basically after 2020. What do we think that impact that's going to have for us?
Talking about the sulfur cap?
Yep.
I don't think it impacts the discussion we're talking today. I mean, yeah, there is a global sulfur cap that is going to come into place in 2020. The United States already has a ECA in place, which already has a lower standard for sulfur fuel. The rest of the world is quite nervous, and I think if nothing else, we all have to commit globally to making sure we enforce the standards and have a level playing field so that no one gains a competitive advantage.
Okay. I want to go ahead and open up for questions from the floor. So if we have some questions and everything, it's right there in the back. There's somebody with a mic. Let's see if we get the microphone over to him. Straight over there in the back. Microphone coming up. I think it's coming over. If you raise your hand, they'll get the microphone over to you.
You may need to go up to the mic.
Oh.
Okay, I'll start. Chris Barrett with Delta Resources, good morning.
Morning.
Most of the discussion this morning has focused on what I'll characterize as traditional sealift, moving personnel, equipment, goods from point A to point B. With the Navy's continued emphasis on distributed lethality and the disaggregated fleet, that translates to some extent to distributed or disaggregated logistics. How does Sealift play into supporting that mission and that configuration?
Thank you. Open it to the panel.
I'll start. It's a great question, but it has to be binned into a couple of different parts. There is deployment and distribution, and they need to be treated separately. Under the deployment side, we have to recognize the ability to quickly deliver a decisive force that will be ready to fight soon after it reaches its port of debarkation. If we break up a brigade combat team, for example, into multiple ships, more than two, then it takes the Army substantially longer to reconstitute the force and turn it into an effective fighting unit. So in that respect, I don't think we will veer too far off of the current models. Distribution and sustainment, certainly we ought to be looking at being more agile, which will enable us to be more resilient, which is absolutely consistent with the National Defense Strategy. So what the Defense Logistics Agency does together with Transcom to ensure we become more agile is an area that we're looking at carefully. Thanks.
I would only just take it to that next, or just continue the thought that Pete already talked about, and that is that in MSC, I mentioned again the four broad areas that we're working in, and one of which is joint and naval interoperability. As the Joint Force and as the Navy is one of obviously attached to the maritime, as they look at how they would need to adapt themselves in a changing operational environment, with that comes changes in doctrine, changes in tactics, changes in warfare. And we're plugged into all of those, the working groups or the war games or the commands like Navy Warfare Development Center. that implements and writes this doctrine to ensure that that as we're looking at our the operations, the concepts that we use to make sure that the supply chain across the maritime remains, relevant in a contested future. The question is very good, and we do and continue to do an enormous amount of thinking in this way. A lot of which I would say we're keeping it relatively close hold, for obvious reasons, on how we're adapting and what we will be able to do and how we can shift from, sort of the classic hub and spoke model that we currently use today to a model that is more agile in an environment in which agility is required. The fleet, it talks about fleet design, and we're plugged into that, as well as the distributed maritime operations, the umbrella strategy that the fleet design has empowered, and again, we're doing a lot of great work with the broader Navy and joint forces to ensure that we can meet the warfighter demands in a distributed or dispersed type of fleet arrangement. It does require us to think differently. It requires us to make some changes and adaptations that the command is fully immersed in doing, and but we acknowledge, just like was mentioned by the question, that work has to be done.
Okay. Anybody else?
A question back there.
Question?
Yes, sir. Rafael Ortiz, Reserve Officers Association, Coast Guard retired. Given the fact that the platforms we have, as you're saying, are decreasing, and in the near future not going to increase that much, yet we have seems to be an increased amount of people who are graduating, Americans, and going to some fleet. I would assume that they're not necessarily going to our fleet. I would think a strategic view would be the more Americans we have on other fleets connected to us would be a good thing, because they're gaining the expertise, yet they have the connection of being U.S. citizens. It seems to me that if we could recruit them as reservists and have that connection to them, it would be a strategic advantage to us to have that in both Coast Guard and Navy. Yet on the reserve side, we're putting huge impediments to having those people do that because of the restrictions. Just thinking strategically, it'd be great if we had 50, 100, 1,000 mariners on the Chinese fleet that all of a sudden were recalled to U.S. service. Has any thought been put to that?
I'll take a first crack at that. Thanks. That's a good question. Thanks for your service in the Coast Guard. And if you want to go military to mariner, we've got some folks that have been working on a program to try to facilitate that for members, and that as a transition from the active services, and that to be able to pick up their merchant marine credential. One thing I would point out, Dr. Kumar is here in the room, and he's on a panel this afternoon. He's going to talk about mariner numbers and that. One of the things we don't know is we don't know how many are sailing on other flagships. It's one of the things in the recent report to Congress identified is we don't have a good picture of where the credentialed mariners. It's not a real-time picture, and we don't have a good way to be able to reach out and contact those mariners for doing that. We know that some do, in fact, do sail in the foreign flag, particularly in the European fleets. American officers in those realms are earning about the same on parity with some of the European merchant marine officers. So they are recruited in that sense. We do have about, I think, 2,200 strategic Sealift officers that are graduates from the maritime academies. And out of that number, I think roughly 1,600 or so are actively sailing today. So they're in the fleet and they're in the pool. And we do have that as a surge capability to pull from. Beyond that, in terms of enrollment in that, my agency does have it's called a Mariner Outreach program where those who would like to be enrolled or contacted, if we needed them from a surge Sealift, could register their information for us with that. John, if you have any.
I just said that's the kind of thinking we need to have. Think outside the box a little bit. So thank you for that. Thanks for your service as well. I think we got to be careful about the numbers. I think more and more, I could be wrong, Kevin, correct me, but I think not every graduate today leaves with a credential.
Small number.
Many go off and do other things with that education. They get into management, other aspects of maritime or power management. So not everyone gets a credential. And I think if you look at the world's fleet, there could be some exceptions, but generally I'm thinking the labor they use is probably a little less expensive than the U.S. labor. So we might have some going to work on foreign flag ships, but that's probably the exception more than the rule.
Yeah.
I think the highest visibility you see is in the passenger cruise lines. You see a lot of Americans going into the cruise lines and sailing for them. Next question. Somebody else with a question.
Would you care to comment, please, on the current status of your thinking or studies about threats to our shipping fleet from non-state adversaries?
Yep.
Well, sir, I think some of the facts, kind of speak for themselves. The biggest in the world stage right now is with the Houthis in the Strait of Bab el-Mandeb. Just this week it was reported, I may have lost track of time, last week it was reported that, a Saudi tanker came under attack. There's been multiple incidents on the order of a dozen or so kinetic events in the Strait of Bab el-Mandeb since October of 16. And this is all done by, a non-state actor, to put a label that you used. So there are threats out there today, and it's why I maintain that our mariners, all mariners, are sailing in contested waters. They may just not know it, or they may not understand, just what the level of threat is. It's my obligation for the ships that sail for me. I'm the operational commander for many ships sailing around the world. And in time of war, I would be the operational commander taking our nation to war across the seas. And it's my obligation to ensure that I do my best to prepare those mariners for what they eventually may face. If your question is specifically then, what are the threats or and so forth, or what are we doing about it? I can tell you that in the Fifth Fleet, in that area where, that's, again, the biggest center of the biggest concern of a non-state player, that Fifth Fleet commander who has the responsibility for mission assurance, that is to look at the threat and then to take the mitigations and actions necessary to ensure mission success. He is doing a fantastic job, I think, of analyzing and applying the necessary protocols, to maximize the vessel safety, at least the U.S. flag vessels that are under, my charge specifically, through the use of escorts and sort of domain awareness, keeping people in understanding of what we see as the potential threat. All of that comes at an expense, I'll tell you that, one that our nation bears, and we should be very proud of that fact, that we have mostly naval forces that are out there. We have some contract security forces also that play a big role here in keeping our vessels secure. So without any more kind of specifics, that generally lets you know that we're paying attention to exactly what you're talking about.
Anybody else?
The only thing I would add to that is we communicate with commercial industry also at the classified level when necessary and share information with them to ensure that they are aware of the threats as they evolve.
We're coming up on the end. That was a very fast 90 minutes. I'd like to take a moment, first off, and thank the Navy League for putting this panel together. I think the Navy League does a great job in advocating this and talking about it, having a panel on strategic Sealift. I think we can do a much better job of getting that information out. Lots of times you get your almanac of sea power, and in the back pages is going to be where this is, but it's on the forefront when all of a sudden they're not there to deliver the goods, the cargo, the mechanisms for supporting our forces overseas. And I think in many ways we've been so good at logistics over the years that sometimes we forget what it takes to make it work seamlessly as it does. I want to thank our panelists, and I want to thank a panel for a fantastic panel and an opportunity to moderate this. I'm sure they'll be around if you have questions afterwards to come on up. If not, I want to just raise a hand for our moderators for today, or our panelists for today. And thank you, gentlemen, for being here today, and thank you for everybody attending. Thank you.